So I am Vipul Bhatti. I live in South London. My background in terms of career, I started out as a financial journalist. I then did a dance degree at London Contemporary Dance School. It was a South Asian strand I combined Kathak with the main subject, which was contemporary dance. But it's not just dance in terms of technique. We did a lot of contextual studies. So we looked at dance history, choreology, improvisation. But then my career went into digital storytelling through journalism, financial journalism, and then to user research, so looking at human behavior when products and services are used. I grew up in South London, and both my parents are from East Africa. Both my parents were born in Nairobi. We're of Gujarati ancestry. My father was raised in Nairobi, and my mother was raised in Zanzibar. My father came in 1964, which at the age of 22, and my mother came in 1971. It was really interesting in 1964 because when him and my Bappa, my father's older brother, came here, they were looking for a room, and wherever they went, there were posters on each available houses, which had the poster reading, no blacks, no Pakis, no dogs, no Irish. And it's interesting that the same kind of sentiments are here today in 2025, even though they arrived in 1964. My grandfather and my grandmothers came from Gujarat, which geographically is northwest India. But my grandfather was much older when my father was born. So my father is the youngest of 8. But going back, if I calculate my grandfather, my father's father, would have been born around 1877. And on my mother's side, that would mean my grandfather would be born around the same time, but they went to Zanzibar. And so inland and coastal or islanders. So I think that's quite interesting. And there's so much to talk about because Zanzibar was a lot more multicultural, a very influential, significant trading space. But also Nairobi, there was a much more of a Gujarati community. And as I grew up, in the late 70s and and across the 80s, we were very much part of our Gujarati community from Nairobi. And so how functions were organized and how weddings were held, it was all about maintaining the same kind of community connections and relations. So whether it was a sports day or Christmas or a wedding or a Diwali function, the same community from East Africa would gather in North London. So my dada had passed away in 1949, and so I know less about their experiences, but even my nana, we didn't really talk about how they came to where they did, but I would guess it was for entrepreneurial reasons. I guess that how you could travel via boat from Gujarat to East Africa. So the kind of I would guess socioeconomic reasons, and so I don't know about those journeys that were made and the decisions behind them. But I think what is interesting is that the same community relations and support that traveled with them. So whether they came from Jamnagar, and then they went, whether they went to Zanzibar or Nairobi, those community relations were very much part of daily life. And also I think, I would be quite interested to learn about, to go from India and then go to East Africa, and how did they integrate themselves with locals, local black East Africans. Interesting fact about my mother's side, my mother's nana, they had a cinema in Nairobi. It was called the Liberty Cinema. And I think that's really interesting, that a cinema, and this is probably why I love film as well, but how people gathered and how they dressed up. It was a really fascinating a way of actually seeing films and the kind of cultural representation of what cinema provides. But more recently, I do speak to my parents about how they would gather as families, as communities, how they would celebrate other people's religious festivities. So one of the interesting things I'm quite drawn to is the relations Indian Gujaratis had with local East Africans, and how they engaged. And from what my understanding is, it was on socioeconomic, that local African Kenyans were working in the houses of Indians, and in our household, the way I interpret it, that it was much more. It was a lot around respect. And Kenyans had almost authority and a say in how households were run, and they were respected. And for me, that tells me that about my family specifically, that we saw each other as people, and being non-hierarchical about it. And it's actually quite fascinating, again, that how I was raised. When my father came in 1964, him and my bapa, they found themselves homeless. One in the winter of 1964, and in those days the snow was really heavy, and as they were homeless, they were crying because my father was 22 and my uncle was 24. And they were lost. They had one coat between them. They were freezing. They didn't know where to go. And it was an elderly Jamaican man who said to them, "Boys, why are you crying?" And my uncle and my father goes, they were kicked out of the house they were living in after a week. And this elderly Jamaican man said, I can rent you a room in my home. And I think it was, again, going back to the whole thing about these posters where it says no blacks, no Pakis, no dogs, no Irish. It was, you saw each other as the experiences you had by being discriminated yourself. When you saw someone else that was struggling, you saw your own respective story and challenges and struggles in someone like them. And I think, I like to think that's part of my own identity as well. And I hear the kind of same common stories from how my mother was raised in Zanzibar, and in the road they lived in, the Balsaras, Freddie Mercury, lived in the same street. I'll tell this story now, that when he passed, my nana and nani went to his parents' house to offer their condolences, not because he was Freddie Mercury, not because he had passed from AIDS or HIV. He was a son of Zanzibar. He was a son of the Balsaras, and therefore he was their son as well. And my grandfather told me this much later in life. And and I think what's going back, I think it's these stories that I think are very much associated with my own South Asianness. That when we used to meet as a family or through community, we shared stories, and it's the same oral tradition that we have in the South Asian classical dance I do, which is Kathak, which derives from the term Kathakar. We are storytellers, and it's through storytelling where I think where we connect, we become we connect and build a bond through humanness. So whether it is the storytelling of Ramayana, and I was told this, I didn't read about it, and then through cable TV you see the story, but it's the whole thing about the human experience of someone that has lived something, and they share that. I think, and it's that oral tradition. I think so, which is so rich, and I'm glad that was part of my childhood. So when we met, whatever the function was, or a family religious ceremony, we connected by storytelling. And I think this is what I'm trying to do more so with my parents as they get older, to tell me what was childhood like in the 1950s, or what were they told by their elders. So the storytelling, the voices, the experiences of what they heard, they experienced, and is still continued and through me, because I believe we are all custodians of lives lived before us. So my story is not doesn't start the day I was born. My story starts many generations before me. And I think it's such a sacred thing to hold, that when I'm asked about my identity is not just me. My identity is firmly rooted in the past, and all those people and all their life experiences that they lived got me to where I am.
How do you identify yourself as an Indian or a British?
It's really interesting. I'm of Gujarati ancestry, but I also, a part of my story is also in East Africa, but I'm born and raised here. And this is the interesting thing. I don't know how to answer that, because a lot of my life, or our lives, goes through different stages, and how we see the world and how we understand the world, we question who we are. I guess that's the question of what Shakespeare asked, to be or not to be. We are or we're not, and what is that? And then it goes to which community do we belong to? Now I'm in my late 40s. I'm going to be soon in the club of 50s. When I was younger, whatever the community I connected to, so it's either the dance community or the journalist community. When I was working in the NHS, it was all about healthcare. So I think we're made up of, I guess, like a Venn diagram. There's so many parts of our lives that overlap. So in the moment, I like to think I'm of everything, but I'm also none of them. And it's quite interesting where I am in that actual moment.
Did you ever come across people who question your being here in the right place? Are you foreign?
Yes.
Where do you really come from?
One of the other questions, the questioning of identity. And maybe that's why there could be a confusion, that when you are asked that question, who are you? There's also that follow-up bit, where are you from? Where do you belong? And then you are told where you are from. Then you are told where you belong. So the confusion can arise that when this constant state of being lost and being found. And I think it then becomes maybe a spiritual thing, that if I am content in who I am, whatever that is, that's where I belong. And several years ago, I was going through different challenges, and I came to a realization that home is not a physical space. And I think, so yes, I have been questioned in the past that, or even told that you are Indian, or how do you, or why do you identify yourself as being East African, or you are British but you're not British. I've been born and raised and lived most of my life in England, so am I English? And so it's this constant questioning of identity. And so within myself, I know I can be perceived as many things, but who I am is who I feel every day. I'm a son, I'm an uncle, I'm a brother, I've been a grandchild, I've been a friend, I've been an artist, I've been a colleague, I've been a stranger. We're all these things all the time in every single microsecond. I don't think I should also do the heavy lifting to explain who I am, because also who I am is also based on my values, my beliefs, empathy. You know, I believe in, I don't understand food poverty or child poverty. I get angry about different types of inequality, whether it's gender, race, you know, the notion of caste system, and you know what shade or brown I am. Am I dark, or am I fortunate to be this color? I could be lighter. And it's interesting is that identities cropping up because someone's probably trying to understand who they are and how do they relate to yourself. So it can be a psychological thing, an insecure thing, finding yourself, like, which social spaces are you in? I have been asked by other South Asians about who I am, because, you know, if you find yourself in a surrounding where you are a minority of being South Asian and you're in a mostly white space, I know from one experience, I went into I think it was a social professional environment, and there was another South Asian guy amongst other in a group of white individuals, and the conversation, I did not feel that individual became very territorialized, that, you know what, these are my white people, you can't come in, and that level of appeasement that I see, that, you know, when you are the minority, you want to fit in.
And but still you live in Britain, which is a dominant white country. Did you feel that you ever that anybody gives you a feeling you're not really belong to this place?
I think with aging, one thing I realized a few years ago, that aging is hard, because when you find your own voice, I mean, your voice is always there, but when you find your voice that's saying, I know what my boundaries are. And it's interesting, the word boundary, because when you're a kid, and I grew up in, and still am, in a very liberal, open Hindu household. The story of Ramayana, you learn what the word boundary is through the term of a Lakshman Rekha. And as you get older, you begin to understand, what does that Lakshman Rekha mean? To protect yourself from what is out of your space, but also to hold and protect yourself, and not giving away yourself, and being who you are when you, and being true to yourself. And I think more and more, I think I can openly say that I'm more and more angry, even though if you met me or speak to other people, I come across, I'm told I'm calm and calming, but the anger comes from that the education system pre-internet you were told what history is, and what the Industrial Revolution is and was, and how it is a momentum, an effort, a symbol of social economic progress and development. As you get older, you realize that was a very glorified narrative by the person, and I say person in a very broad, pluralistic way of what they wanted, how they wanted to represent their identity. Whilst now someone like me will be questioned or told what my identity is. So when we look at colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, wealth distribution, historical GDP, also looking at how was India alone impacted by the Raj, if you call it that. And even when we had the passing of the late Queen Elizabeth, I remember this really significant, I thought it to be significant, where the hearse, her coffin, as it was going down Pall Mall, and they had the crown there, and they described the pearls, and I think it was a sapphire, I can't remember. They described every single, so many parts of the crown, but there was one particular gem that they did not mention, and that was the Kohinoor. So even if we take that as a story, that story was excluded because, and that symbolically, that tells me so much, because everyone knows the story of the Kohinoor, but that told me one thing, that we, even though we are the gem of the crown, but our shine is not spoken about. Oh, I didn't really study colonial history, and I think that's the interesting thing if we look at the education system, that you are taught, and you are taught what you are learnt. And I went into Croydon Library more recently, and you were only told what to learn on the subjects you were given. And I think growing up more and more, especially with social media, more and more stories are coming out. And I'm reading a book at the moment, and unfortunately I can't remember the author's name, but it is called The Raj at War. And in the early pages, there's this really interesting line where it says that Great Britain or Britain did not fight or participate in World War II. It was the British Empire. And I think that's the thing, you know, that even in this great story, because that's how it's now told as a story, that the fight, the great battle, is only told through whiteness. And now other stories of the armed forces from the Caribbean, from Africa, from South Asia, and in this case, India, how were lives impacted? And not lives just by those from the armed forces, but through healthcare, nurses, doctors, the postal network, even farmers, going even, the book I'm at the beginning of the book, but the book also talks about people in different levels of society. It even talks about how sex workers were impacted in India by the war, but also how the social economic impact on war and the Great Bengal famine. And these stories are only coming up more and more now. But what is interesting is that we are telling the stories, but who is listening? And again, it goes back to, and if you look at intergenerational trauma, that the PSTD is still there. We just don't know it there. And it's when we become informed and when we learn about our stories, it becomes very triggering. And so therefore, if we look at what we've inherited different things in terms of art, culture, food, how we write, what words we use, how we tell stories, but we also inherited trauma and disease and illness. We've also inherited how we are quiet, how we hide, how we appease. So there's so many things what we've inherited. Even now, when we're looking at the time when we are looking at the story of Windrush. And now it's interesting. I went on the overground, and which is now the Windrush line, or different parts of it. And I did have a conversation that, so why does it have to be called Windrush? My question is, well, why not? And this is the interesting thing, is that the same now for the last few weeks, how Grenfell was impacted, and now it's like, well, the only way to go to progress is like you just get rid of the building. And I think that is in a very it's much more than a removal, that you take down a building, but that building talks about how many lives were suffered, were devastated, how many lives as a result are being impacted. And the only way to address it is through an imperialistic act to remove it. Because if you remove it, then you take away the story. And I think that's what we have seen after so many years, that we naturally become activists when we start telling our stories. And I think that's then we go back to that big question: what is your identity? Who are you? And I am one person, but I'm not made of one person stories. Speaking earlier on about inherited trauma, my mother's side are much more vocal, and also actually my daddy, she was also very vocal. This strength that came from this generation, that they spoke up, they were fearless, they refused to hide or be hidden, and I think maybe that is within me. But then being born and raised here, and being again questioned quite repeatedly, not even when I was younger or throughout my educational life and then through work, you can be asked who you are, but you do not know the actual intention behind the question. And I think it's even more now, that when I realize what the inherited trauma is, of how I've held in I've suppressed my voice. So therefore, I'm not, I wouldn't be as outspoken as I could be or as I am now. And this, it takes me back to a really interesting event I went to. It was looking at diversity and inclusion at the workplace, and it was an LGBTQ plus space, and on the panel you had 5 people, all who were selected to speak about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And just by observation, if we just look at it as data, as what these people represented, they were all white. 4 white men, 1 white woman, talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And it did not sit right with me. And I don't like to speak, especially to stand up and speak through a mic. But then I could not. And then I started preparing a script. Then I asked for the mic, and I got the mic. And then I said, can we please speak about the R word, racism? And then my question looked at, as it was the workplace, looking at product design, development, management, strategy, customer experience, everything that makes the workplace. And there was silence. And no one knew how to answer that. And then one of the panelists said to me, I don't know about your experience. But that's a very, really kind of crucial thing of that moment, that someone can talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, but hadn't had the experience of being othered, but yet was given the opportunity to speak. And then there was a woman in the audience who happened, I don't want to assume her identity, but I think she was South Asian, from what I remember. She said, well, look at me, look how I am. And it goes back to what was, she spoke on their behalf. She protected them. And it was that level of appeasement that actually shut down what I was trying to address, that when a person who is white doesn't have the answer, another person of color who has been afforded opportunity will speak on their behalf, rather than actually address things, the things like that are colonial imperialism, patriarchy, whiteness, that not just I experience as an individual, but the actual whole thing about workplaces, product development, strategy, sales, you know, it all goes back to people. So therefore, these places are not inclusive and equal and diverse, because you have a chosen people speaking about them who don't have lived experiences. Interestingly, all the other people of color came up to me, and the only one trans white woman came up to me saying, thanking me for the asking that question. But then what was interesting after that was that there was a Southeast Asian guy who came up to me, said, thanking me, saying that was a really important question that you raised, but I would be careful if I was you, because if you talk about racism, you will find yourself being excluded.
So are you saying not much has changed?
And that was in 2023. And I think that's the other thing, is that even when we look at the political landscape right now, there is a removal of DEI policies, which we are now seeing. and it's scary, but also what we do see is the rise, the emergence of activism, whether you march or not, but how you put a post up on Instagram or TikTok, people are speaking up for other people. There is a great kind of mobilization from micro to macro, and that is powerful because people are speaking for other people. How we make food, what were the ingredients, how did people, stories of, let's say, Martin Luther King, he's kind of inspiration, or Rosa Parks, and people from different parts of the world were inspired and by other people, and now we are becoming informed by history, but we are also making our own stories, and I think that is powerful.
You're also yourself, you're a professional dancer in two traditions. Do you feel in this area there's rather a change, or is it the same as everywhere else?
One of the interesting things of going to a conservatoire or a contemporary dance school, and having learnt Kathak there more, is that where you find yourself within a system, and reflecting, it was a very kind of, even though it's a creative space, an artistic space, but it was also, like many spaces, very bureaucratic and had its own kind of imperialistic mechanisms of how it was functioned. But more so now, in my body, how I curate work, whether it is using the lexicon of Kathak, or the kind of ideas which could be defined as contemporary. I kind of see it the same kind of duality of being British South Asian, that I find patterns and themes and architecture and detailed and minimalism and geometry. So I use the same kind of stylistic qualities from both, and I think that's probably my own approach to design. I would think that now there is a lot more, there's a wider representation of dance and dancers and arts and curiosity and storytelling through, there's a lot more, I think, styles and of dance and movement coming together, where there is an equality of the artist, and I think that's remarkable, because even now when I'm on my Instagram feed, I mean, I'm drawn to the indigenous movement expressions of, let's say, in certain tribes in Ethiopia, but I'm also looking at tap dance in the golden age of Hollywood cinema, but then you also see what people in different parts of Africa are dancing, and I think that is what is, I think, so beautiful, that we can be informed by movement and dance, and I like to think that is what is beautiful, because there's a lot more integration and curiosity and questioning, that how can we bring this kind of interweaving of humanness, which is movement, non-verbal, and I think that is beautiful, and it's not also age led or bound, or you don't have to. I think one thing I've also seen, I think it's a German Bollywood a German white artist. She is just fascinated by Hindi cinema, and she is an incredible artist. And then there is, I think he's East African guy, a black guy, and he lip syncs to Hindi songs, and he does it so well that you would think that's his expression, because it is. And I think that's the most amazing thing, that we are exchanging and sharing and celebrating as artists. And I think that's what art and artists can do and should do, is that we can find ourselves in someone else's identity and expression because it resonates with something within us, and we might not be able to understand it, but it's something that we feel, and what we feel is the humanness.
So you wouldn't use the word cultural appropriation for that?
I think that's, in terms of cultural appropriation, that's a big thing. I think it's context as well, that if you are saying, oh, that it's when one thing I find quite grating when we gesture as in screwing in the light bulb. That is cultural, for me, is cultural appropriation, because what is that? Surely it is this, the opening of the lotus. And what does this signify? It is not just a flower blooming, but it's the release of a fragrance. It's the velvetiness of its leaves. It can be about the pollination of a bee into the nectar, but yet it is reduced to how South Asian or Indian people move, that all we do is screw in light bulbs. So even there, it is the kind of imperialism that we are people that we have to be the ones that are screwing in the light bulb. And that thing is that it comes to that, our expression in terms of dance is reduced, minimalized to, when I've been told, so I do Indian classical dance, or one of them, and they will say, well, is that Bollywood dance? And it's like, well, no, it's not. If I was to equate it to anything, let's say we look at ballet, and I think that's the other interesting thing, that even in the classical dance world, that there's also a hierarchy, that if you are ballet trained, that you have a different, you have the heightened, enhanced level of virtuosity and athleticism. But if you're doing Indian classical dance, well, you don't. And I think that's the sad thing, is that the intelligence, the way we curate and make work, how our rhythm system, how we express, how we can isolate different parts of our anatomy, how we express through the face, that is highly intelligent. It is highly expressive. It is highly athletic and virtuosic. And it is a dance where you can do through your entire lifetime. Whether you are a younger dancer or starting dance in your 60s, or you are an exponent that has done dance throughout your life and you're in your 80s, it's within you. And I think it doesn't get the same level of respect and recognition as ballet does. And I think that's the sad part. And I think maybe that's what we should be speaking up more about. And that's the thing, is even in Hindi cinema, that's all I know of. I'm not going to say all of Indian cinema, specifically Indian Hindi cinema. There is almost an absence, a deprivation of Indian classical art, dance. Music is not the same. We only have, or the detail of Indian classical dance is not there. there's almost like to emulate a Western style, which is good as well, but it's like that's all we should be doing, rather than why not have more Indian classical dance, because it can be contemporary, it can be innovative, it is equally expressive, and it's sad that we're not showing this more, because it's part of our storytelling, it's part of our physical, non-verbal identity.
Can I ask you one question, going back to your, how did you get into dance? Was it a quest for you to find your Indian identity through Kathak?
So I came to dance, I think it's quite strange. I didn't dance until I was 25. But then again, that's the other interesting thing about being Gujarati, because dance doesn't just happen to you. Every year you would go to Navratri, you know, so it is this kind of social aspect or identity of your life, is that for 9 days you are doing Garba, and it's I'm fascinated, drawn to Garba, because it's a social dance. It's, what does it mean? I think it's a harvest dance. I'm not entirely sure, but that's what it was told. We are looking at circles. We're looking at the cycle of life. We are celebrating 9 goddesses over 9 nights, who each represent a force, a strength. And it's interesting about Garba, and my observation, that it is such an open dance. It doesn't matter whether you know it, excel at it, have mobility issues as you dance, but you are all part of the same cycle, the circle. So my kind of journey with dance didn't start when I went to dance school, or when I went to started learning Kathak. I would say it was from a very community level, and again the spiritual aspect of it. That so my kind of translation of Garba is that it is actually a puja, it is prayer. It is not just a dance because I am giving my soulfulness, and it's shared with every single person, that we are dancing because we feel a joy, and there is music and there is food. So it's that kind of the spirituality of collective movement. I think that's beautiful. Also, so I went into dance. I went to an after party of a Bollywood film. My friends saw me dance. They said I should dance, so I started dancing, and I happened to go into Kathak, and then I went to London Contemporary Dance School. So I learnt technique and notation and dance history and biology and so many other things, improvisation, and that taught me how I see movement. I was able to look at spatial relationships. I was able to look at some things that were surreal and abstract, so the same kind of ideas that we see in art, and other things that have been, other artists that have been influenced by social, economic, political things that they were influenced by, that informed their art. Minimalism, things that we do in pedestrian movement, and then that's what kind of, I think, informs that how I look at dance, is that I look at people, I look at spaces, how we gather, how we connect, isolation, individuality, commonality. So that's kind of my story of dance.
I think it's you talk about cultural expression, music and dance, which you combine with your talking about identity, which, of course, you talked about that. And early on, you also mentioned the food is also a cultural expression, and it's important for you.
God, food. So I've always been vegetarian. I don't come from a vegetarian household or family, and I don't know. I was either, if I ate non-vegetarian food, I'd be sick or I refused it, and then it's become part of my life, and now I've been vegan for 10 years as well. And so, but I come from a family, and I think it's very common in the other South Asian families that I know of, and even our neighbors who I've grown up with. Food is such a very thing that connects us as people, how we bond. And it's not just food, it's flavor, it's preparation. I was having a conversation with, I don't know who, some people about what does food mean. I went to an arts event, and I was speaking to two Caribbean guys of different generations, and we were talking about, what does food mean? And we might not say the actual words, I love you, but we'll give food. So, and I think that there's so much affection and kindness and compassion, and food is nourishing, it's comforting. So, it's the whole thing about eating together. Growing up, I was very close to my cousins. I grew up with my father's side more, because they were all based in South London, but we would eat together 4 or 5 times a week. We ate as a family. People could drop in, our neighbours would drop in, and even when I went to North London where my Nana and Nani lived, everything was about food. Whatever the food was, people cooked together. They made the prepared food, whether it was papa or atana. There's so much around the kind of bonding experience of people connecting through food and flavor. So it's I guess it's almost like I think if you were to say what food in fact I was asked what is my favorite dish, and I said atari, because it is made up of so many small pots, but each kind of bowl has its own flavor and ingredient, and then you have rice, and then you have the puri, and then you have the gator, you'd have chutney. You have so many things, and separately they're individual, but they come together. And I think it's and I still eat an atari every single day. It's my preferred way, and I eat with my hands, which is I know it's just such a comforting thing to do.
What about language? Does language play a big role in your identity?
Language.
You speak Gujarati.
I speak Gujarati. I can speak Hindi, and I'm learning Urdu as well, and also being of East African rooting through my parents. There's Swahili, and it was interesting that Swahili words kind of crept into my daily language, and then when I started meeting Indians from India, and I said that the words that I thought were Gujarati, and which were actually Swahili. So I think that's really interesting how language is how you express yourself through language, and my thinking language can be Gujarati and Hindi more. I think it's the kind of poetry behind it. I'm thinking much more in Gujarati more as well. And I think I do that for myself, but I think it's also about how certain words and sentiments are able to be expressed in different languages, even though I use English a lot more. But then even in my Kathak grading, Sanskrit would come in, and Braj Bhasha would come in. We learnt a Kavit, a poet, which was done in Braj Bhasha, which is much more regional. So I think that's the interesting thing about language, that whether it is sung or whether it is spoken, how my physical expression can change.
We touched upon a bit about colonial history and your perspective. If history were to repeat itself, would you feel comfortable living in India, and how would you see yourself in India?
I don't know about living in India. I can't actually see the scenario of living in India. And I think what I feel is a blessing and gift, and I say just because I've been born and raised in London, is that London, I feel, has almost like the world in one city. That you can, whether you are traveling or whether you are waiting or whether you're in a queue or whether you're in a restaurant, that I have the gift of having injera, or going to this vegan restaurant which was Korean and Italian, or there's this or I can go to a Polish restaurant, or more and more I realize that how you have Polish dumplings, and then you have Nepalese dumplings, and then you have dim sum. It's interesting what just flour and water can do, and have collective different kinds of ingredients, and the translation of what is a dumpling is just as personal to someone who's Polish and Nepalese, or a region of China. And I think being in London, I don't think I would want to be anywhere else. Whether I'm questioned about being Indian or not, or what role is my rooting in East Africa, or if I'm Gujarati or anything else, I would say first and foremost I am a Londoner, because it is global, it is borough-led, it is individual, that I can travel anywhere, but I can still be in the same place. The questions of identity in the future. In the most simple way, I hope we see each other as being as human as us. Because, why do I say that? So I'm doing a master's in cognition and computation, and in the most simplest way, it is looking at how the brain, the mind, with the machine, processes of information to understand human behavior. And in that course, in that program, I had the experience of sitting in a brain dissection, and the individual whose brain that was being dissected was someone that had passed from Parkinson's. And it was when you saw that brain, it was just some grey matter. And that was the interesting thing. And this thing within all of us that's in here, that supports our heart, our gut, and all of our other organs, and all the other sensory systems, how we see, how we hear, how we taste, how we smell, how we touch. That's common in all of us, all human beings. And I'm not talking about animals. That's another thing, being vegan. But we have everything within us that where we can be equal, there can be more equity. We are individual, and that's interesting, brains are different. But the sad thing is, how we develop vision, perspective, narrates, dictates how we connect, perceive another human being. So my question is, in this heaviness, overwhelmingness of our world, and all this destruction and devastation, dystopia, what does it take when we all say enough is enough? Because enough is enough has happened so many times in the future. And what are we learning? And life is finite. We like to think that every day is just a day, but it is a gift. The way I mean, every night I pray my own way, and I thank the universe that I was able to wake up, and I was able to wake up, that I can wake up, I can breathe. And that's the thing, is every single person has their own struggles. And we don't know what someone is living with, challenged by. And we, as mental health is spoken about much more, it's rife, it's prevalent. And we have our struggles. But what holds us back as people, as a civilization, as the generation of now, what holds us back from sharing, making sure that basic elementary needs are accessible to all? And I think that's what I'm challenged by, that how do we do this? What will it take? We have the abundance of so much, yet so many people in that world do not have that. And that can go from food deprivation to gender inequality, healthcare accessibility, things I cannot understand, even being of South Asian origin, that why do we still have caste system? Why do we discriminate and question on colorism? Why do we define and tell and process in our own minds that someone has this identity because they're of a different skin tone? Why do we do this? I just don't understand that. You don't have to even have these questions. You have these questions, and it doesn't even, you don't have to be of an older generation. You can be Generation Z and still be discriminating for someone's color, caste, and why are we categorizing people by how much money they have, or what job they have, or who they want to hold hands with, how they dress? Surely we should be asking questions that, do you see me as another human being? Do you see a stranger as another human being? Do you see another stranger as an equal person? So, and why do we do this? Is it because there's something within us that we're not courageous enough, brave enough to confront? So the story really begins within us.
The grandparents and even your parents, they were in a different era. They were brought up in, they had different challenges, different struggles. And how do they see you as a 40-plus-year-old young guy in London? Can you talk a bit about that?
So I lost my nanny last year and she was 93, and I am fortunate that at the time I was 47, and at my age I still had a grandparent. That is a gift. And I had my dadi as well when I was, in fact I even had my great grandmother when I was 23. And that is phenomenal, because um, I have their energy, and we have that. We hold neurons. When we're by even in my genes, I have all those people that lived before me. I have their existence within me. How would they see me? I would like to think that who they were as individuals, who they were in their own humanity, I would like to think that they saw those kind of values and beliefs within me as well. That what I live by, how I see the world, how I engage with the world, whether I am uplifted by something, or whether I am angry, or whether I feel that deep desire to protest for something or for a group of people that I'm not affected by personally, but through our humanness, that someone else's denial of their existence irks me. I would like to think that my grandparents and their foreparents had the same beliefs, and maybe what I feel as an individual is something that I've also inherited. That energy, that when they and I know my grandparents did feel that, but I would like to think that I am part of their legacy as well. That what they lived for, and along the line, I was born. I would like to think that they see me as a empathetic person who is questioning and hurt by other people's struggles, but also I have this fight within me that I speak up and stand up and speak out for those, because I think they did that. So if there's anything I would like to think that they have passed on and that they see, is that I'm still part of their spirit.